The United Nations World Food Programme says millions of lives could be lost in the DRC if the international community doesn't step in to help. The country is struggling with conflict as it navigates its way through COVID-19. The World Food Programme says many could lose their lives to hunger. We're now joined by Gerald Berg, who is the World Food Programme's Regional Communications Officer in Southern Africa. Gerald, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. I was reading your statement, and it really paints a devastating picture for the Congolese. Your figures say 4 in 10 of the DRC's estimated 100 million people are food insecure. That's a crisis.
That's a huge crisis, Clement. It's a long-running crisis. It's one of the most complex, one of the largest hunger crises on the planet. More than 15 million people are suffering what the experts characterize as crisis and emergency hunger. So a massive problem. Millions of people on the edge, in danger of falling over the edge. We can't let that happen. The international community must not let that happen.
And I guess it doesn't really help that on top of the violence and conflict in that country, there is also COVID-19. There are also fears of poor harvest, and all of that is worsening this already alarming situation.
Indeed, yeah. In 2019, the World Food Programme reached a record 6.9 million people in the DRC, the hungriest of the hungry. In 2020, we are looking at trying to support 8.6 million people, another record, and at least 1 million of those are directly affected by COVID-19. So we're in uncharted territory, desperately trying to help people who are in desperate need of help.
And what is the greater need? What are people needing right now the most?
Well, food is, of course, the big issue. We provide food assistance in the form of commodities, so rations of cereal, pulses, vegetable oil. A significant and increasing component of our support is in the form of cash to enable people to go to markets and buy the food that they want. But of course, COVID-19 has had an impact in all kinds of respects. It has rendered folk in cities, people dependent on the informal sector who typically lived hand to mouth, render those unemployed. In the countryside, it has also had an impact. Movement restrictions have prevented smallholder farmers, for example, getting to their fields to cultivate and harvest, and then getting to market to sell their produce. So COVID is having an impact all across the board, and the socioeconomic impacts we know, and they will be protracted, will very likely outlast and outweigh the health impacts.
You are now calling on the international community to step in and assist. How can that community assist, and what are the consequences of there being no swift action here?
Well, the World Food Programme, for the remainder of the year, we require an additional $170 million US dollars to fully execute the programs that we have in mind, the programs for those 8.6 million people that I mentioned. Yes, that is a very significant sum of money, but as I mentioned, we seek to support the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. We are an entirely voluntarily funded organization, so dependent on the generosity of governments, of businesses, and of individuals. And essentially, Clement, if we do not manage to mobilize that money, we are going to have to cut off people that we have determined are particularly vulnerable, those, as I said, suffering from the crisis and emergency hunger. So we're going to have to cut people off our lists. We're going to have to reduce rations, and malnutrition rates, which are already very high. We've got 3.4 million children under 5 in the DRC who are suffering acute malnutrition. All of those numbers are going to get worse if we don't manage to mobilize the sort of funding that we absolutely require.
Yeah, and let's hope the international community will step in. Then you will be able to mobilize this funding to help the Congolese. Gerald, thank you so much for your time this evening. Gerald Berg is the World Food Programme's Regional Communications Officer in Southern Africa.